Our sermon passage this morning is from the book of Genesis, chapter 22. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, so turn there with me and follow along as I read. Genesis 22, verses 1 to 19. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went, both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba.
Thanks, Mallory. Well, we are continuing our sermon series in the book of Genesis this morning. And as we do, we come to what is in a lot of ways the climax of the account of Abraham and the greatest test of faith in what was really a lifetime of tests of faith that we've been looking at over the past several weeks. But as we see Abraham respond to the test of faith in these verses this morning, how he responds is almost as shocking and surprising as the test itself. Like, not that there haven't been times along the way where Abraham has acted in faith. When God told him to leave his father's household and go to the land that he would show him, he went. When God told him that he was going to give him as many offspring as there are stars in the sky, he believed. When God told him to be circumcised as a sign of his covenant relationship with God, he did it. But he's also lied about his wife being his sister because he was afraid of someone killing her or killing him to take her more than once. And he's produced an offspring through Hagar because he was afraid that he and Sarah were getting too old to have a child together. And so when Abraham's faced with the most difficult test that he's faced yet, one that even we look at and can't imagine how anyone could go through with what he's asked to do, how he responds here almost makes us wonder if this is the same Abraham we've been tracking along with for the last 10 chapters. How does he respond so differently here than at any other point in his life? In only 2 chapters after the most recent episode of being driven by fear to lie about his wife. Well, at one level, it's because he's just like us. Like this complicated mixture of belief and unbelief. Like we can resonate with the Father in Mark 9:24. Like, I believe, help my unbelief. But at another level, it's because something huge happened in chapter 21, right? Like the son that God had promised and that he had waited for 25 years had been born. And so, like, this is a really bad illustration, but it's kind of like back in 2009 when I went on a mission trip to South Sudan for the first time. Like, I had to get something like 12 shots so that I could go on this trip, like all these immunizations so that they would let me in the country. And I don't know about you, but I'm a wimp when it comes to doctors. So I was terrified of having to get all these shots. And I mean, it's embarrassing because, like, I mean, here I am, like, grown man, like, literally shaking, and my heart, like, pounding as I'm climbing up on that table for these two nurses to give me the first round of 3 or 4 shots. And, and I'm trying to look brave and tough on the outside, but, like, there's no way I was fooling anybody. Well, so the very first shot, the nurse gets it ready, and before she gives it to me, she looks at me and she says, "I'm sorry, this one just hurts." And I'm like, why would you do that to me? Like, why would you say that? Like, I'm already about to pass out. I'm so afraid up here. Like, that is not helpful. And I mean, I don't say any of that out loud, of course, because I'm trying to look all tough and act like this is no big deal. But inside, like, my anxiety level goes from, like, here to here, But I grit my teeth, and she gives me that first shot. And as soon as she does, I immediately realized how much I was overreacting. Because guess what? Like, that shot that she even just warned me about, how bad it was, like, hardly felt like anything. And all that anticipation, all that fear, and it really wasn't that bad. And that totally changed then how I responded to the rest of the shots that I had to get, and really every shot I've had to get ever since then. Like, so much so that when I went into another place a few weeks later to get another one of the shots, that nurse was like, "Man, you're really relaxed. Usually people are so nervous about this." I told her this is like the 10th shot I've had to get in the past month, so it's no big deal. But yeah, like, here's the point. Like, my previous experience helped me to respond differently in the future. And again, like, that's a terrible illustration. It falls short on so many levels. But the point is what James says in James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. He says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." The testing of our faith produces steadfastness. It's like how physical exercise makes our muscles stronger. Like, when our faith is exercised, the more steadfast it becomes. And so Abraham had been waiting 25 years for God to provide the son who all of his other promises hinged on. And Abraham genuinely believed that God would provide. Like, we saw that in chapter 15. Like, he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And in the waiting and anticipation, we've seen Abraham's fears stirred up and how he tried to take matters into his own hands. Because in spite of Abraham's fear and lack of faith at the time, God had blessed him and protected him and provided for him in a lot of ways. But that ultimate promise that God made to him was still unfulfilled. And as time went on, it felt more and more impossible. Like, they were old, past the point of having children. And so that's why when God tells them, this time next year you're going to have a son, they laugh. Like, it's too much. It's unbelievable. But God supernaturally provided the impossible and unbelievable, and Isaac was born. And the birth of Isaac was the key to the fulfillment of all the other promises. And so that experience of 25 years of believing that God was going to do the impossible and unbelievable, and then seeing him finally do it, produced steadfastness in Abraham. So when Abraham's faced with another impossible, unbelievable situation, like the most difficult test of faith Abraham has faced yet, this time he responds in faith and obedience because he's convinced that the Lord will provide. How? Because he's seen him do it. He's seen him provide the impossible and unbelievable before. And so he's able to respond differently when he's faced with the unbelievable and impossible now. Like God's provision in the past fuels Abraham's faith that he will provide in the future. And that faith then fuels Abraham's obedience in a situation that seems impossible and unbelievable and even unthinkable that God would ask him to do what he asked him to do. Like that's where we're going in our passage this morning. And so there's so much that we could get into in these verses here. But I really want to just focus in on this one central theme that runs through the passage. And we're going to walk through three main scenes of this narrative here and see what's in the first heading on your handout there, that faith in God's provision fueled Abraham's obedience. There's three things that this passage really highlights: Abraham's obedience, Abraham's faith, and God's provision. But we're going to see that those three things are inseparable. Like Abraham obeys because Abraham believes that God will provide. And because Abraham trusts and obeys, he experiences God's provision in a way he never would have experienced if he hadn't trusted and obeyed. So that's what we're going to see first. Faith in God's provision fueled Abraham's obedience. And then we're going to connect the dots forward in the storyline of the Bible and see how the same is true for us. That just like faith in God's provision fueled Abraham's obedience, faith in God's provision fuels our obedience as well. Like we may not face the exact same kind of test that Abraham's faced with here in this chapter. I mean, hopefully not, right? Abraham had a unique role in history that we don't have. But we do face tests of our faith in other ways. Like most of us in this room could probably list off ways that our faith is being tested right now. Health struggles, financial struggles, family struggles, struggles at school, like whatever it is. How do you respond in obedience and faith like Abraham does here? Well, just like God provided for Abraham, we're going to see how he has provided for us in a way that should fuel our faith and fuel our obedience as well. And so look with me first at verses 1 and 2 here in Genesis 22. And we'll see how faith in God's provision fueled Abraham's obedience. And first we're going to look at Abraham's test. Will he trust God and obey when asked to do the unthinkable? Look at chapter 22, verse 1. It says, "After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you.'" So notice first here that verse 1 begins, "After these things." And so in one sense, it's marking off a new section of the text, but it's also connecting this back to what we saw before, specifically the things we saw last week in chapter 21, like we already talked about, especially the birth of Isaac in fulfillment of the promises that God had made 25 years before. But also in light of Abraham then being called to send Ishmael, his other son, away and commit all his hope to Isaac, and in light of the covenant and oath that Abraham had made with Abimelech and how Abraham responded to that by planting this large tree in Beersheba, calling on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God, like this little glimpse of Abraham establishing this little outpost of Eden in the promised land. So at the end of chapter 21, everything seems to be going right. Like it might have taken 25 years, but it looks like the promises of God are beginning to be fulfilled. But then the last verse of chapter 21 tells us that Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. So some time goes by. We're not told how far ahead, we're fast forwarding here, but it's clear in chapter 22 that a number of years have gone by. Chapter 21, Isaac had just been weaned, probably 2 or 3. But here in this chapter, he's old enough to ask questions and carry a bundle of wood on his shoulders. And the same word for boy is used for him here that had been used for Ishmael in chapter 21. So Isaac is probably now a teenager around the age Ishmael had been in the last chapter. So we're talking at least 10 years, maybe 15 have gone by since the end of chapter 21. But after these things then, in the context of everything going right, Abraham experiencing the beginnings of the promises being fulfilled, number of years, we're told that God tested Abraham. And there's 2 main things to understand about this. One is that we as the readers are told what's about to happen is a test, but Abraham doesn't know that. Like, it wouldn't really be a test if he did. We're told that this is a test, though, to guard us somewhat against the shock of what God is going to ask Abraham to do, and to make sure that we're asking the right question through the rest of the story. Because apart from knowing that this is a test, the right question would be, why would God ask Abraham to do that? Like, how could God ask Abraham to do that? But knowing that this is a test means that there's a different question we should be asking throughout this passage, which gets into the second thing to understand here. It's that God testing his people is a consistent theme throughout the Bible. Now, I wish we had time to dive into this morning, go through a whole biblical theology of testing. But when you look at God testing his people throughout the Bible, the point isn't God being mean or trying to trip his people up. It's James 1, to exercise their faith muscles and produce steadfastness in them. It's putting them in situations where they will have to trust God and obey, whether they understand what's going on or not. And through the test, the genuineness of their faith is shown, and the steadfastness of their faith is increased. And so the point is, knowing that what's about to happen is God testing Abraham, helps us to ask the right question going forward in this passage. And the question is not, why would God ask Abraham to do that? It's, will Abraham trust God and obey? And that's going to be important because in so many ways, what God asked Abraham to do is shocking and unimaginable. I mean, look though next, before we get to that, at how God approaches Abraham. He calls his name, Abraham. Abraham responds, "Here I am," which we're going to see that repeated 3 times in these verses. He's not just telling God where he is, like when I'm calling for one of my kids and I don't know where in the house they are. It's like when I have something important I want to tell them or ask them to do, so I call their name and I want their attention. And so here I am here. He's saying he's paying attention. He's ready to listen and obey. And so look then at what God tells him to do. Verse 2. There's 3 parts to what God tells Abraham to do here. First, he's told to take his son. And then you get these three phrases in the ESV here. It's actually 4 in the Hebrew. Isaac's name comes last. And so each of them build on the other and get more and more specific. And so take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. I mean, you can just feel the depth of the relationship and the emotion as these phrases build on each other. Like God is telling Abraham to take his son, the promised offspring, the son he'd waited 25 years for and miraculously received from the Lord when it was humanly impossible, who he deeply loved. And second, he's told to go to the land of Moriah, which we'll talk more about the significance of this place later. But for now, the main significance is that name, Moriah, is a play on a key word that's going to come up multiple times through the rest of this passage. It's a word that's translated in some places as see or saw, and in some places provide. So Abraham is going to see the place from afar, and God is going to provide, or you could translate that word as see to it. The God's going to see to it. He's going to provide. And so we don't know anything else about this place yet, but this is a huge clue up front. Like Abraham is to take his only son, whom he loves, and go to the land of Moriah, which is a play on this word provide. Third, and here's the shocking part, he's told to offer his son as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that God will tell him. And Moses' audience would have been familiar with this. Like, this is Leviticus, taking a spotless, innocent animal, slitting its throat, and then burning the whole thing completely up as an act of worship to God. Its life covering and atoning for the sin of the one offering it. So Abraham is to take Isaac, go to Moriah, and offer him as a burnt offering. I know I keep using this word, but it's a shocking command, like for so many reasons. But at the top of the list is how impossible it is to imagine going through with any of this if any of us were asked to do this with any of our children. I mean, it's just unthinkable. But then on top of that, Isaac isn't just any child. Like he's Abraham's only son that he dearly loves, and he's the one on whom all the promises hinge. Like if he sacrifices Isaac, everything God has promised falls apart. So feel how unbelievable, how impossible, and just how flat out unthinkable what God is telling Abraham to do is. Like, this is why Moses has to help us out by telling us that this is a test. Otherwise, we'll get too caught up in all the questions that we want to ask and lose sight of the question that we should be asking, which again is, will Abraham trust God and obey when asked to do the unthinkable? And here's the thing, do you notice how this command echoes the first command God gave Abraham back in chapter 12? So back there is to go to the land he would show him, and here it's to go to the land of Moriah, to a mountain that God would tell him. And so in a lot of ways, those two commands and those two tests bookend the story of Abraham. In a lot of ways, the test here is the ultimate expression of the test that Abraham's been facing all along. Will he trust God to provide and obey even when it makes no sense and even when it feels like it's going to cost him everything? Because here's the deal, when you get the thing you've been waiting for a really long time, it can easily go from being a blessing to being an idol. So is Abraham's faith that God will provide or that Isaac will? Those are the questions that this test sets up. Look next at how Abraham responds then. And again, this is almost as shocking as the test itself. Verses 3 through 10, we see Abraham respond with unhesitating obedience and unwavering faith. And so there's actually 4 parts to this middle section of the passage. And they're set up in a pattern where the 2 outside parts focus on the obedience of Abraham, and the 2 inside parts focus on the faith of Abraham. So first look at verses 3 and 4 and see Abraham's unhesitating obedience here. It says, "So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar." So we hear the command that God gives Abraham in verse 2, and we can't help but start putting ourselves in Abraham's place and thinking about all the things he must have been feeling and all the thoughts and questions and objections that must have been running through his mind. But the text doesn't tell us anything about that. The closest we get is the 2 sentences he speaks out loud to his servants and to Isaac that we'll look at in a minute. Other than that, we're not let into Abraham's head at all to know what he was thinking or feeling. All we get to do is watch what Abraham does. And look at what he does. Immediately after this command from the Lord, he gets up early the next morning, he saddles his donkey, he takes a couple of his servants to help with the journey, he takes Isaac like he was told, he cuts the wood for the offering, and he goes to the place that God told him to go. No hesitation, no questioning, no arguing, just immediate obedience. And that little detail at the beginning of verse 4 there, on the 3rd day, this was not a quick trip. He had 3 days to think about what he was doing. He had 3 days to turn back. But we don't get any indication that he ever considered it. He just obeys. Now, I don't think for a second that means that Abraham didn't necessarily spend those whole 3 days arguing with God in his head, pleading with God to change his mind, pleading with God for another way. But the way he's presented in the text, we're supposed to see that Abraham just immediately obeys, without question and without hesitation. And that's supposed to make us ask, how? How can Abraham respond to that command with that kind of obedience? Well, that's what the 2 center sections clue us into. And again, these 2 center sections, we see Abraham's unwavering faith. And so look at the second part here in verses 5 and 6. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son. He took in his hand the fire and the knife, and they went both of them together. So they get within sight of the mountain that God told Abraham to go to. And the servants of the donkey, they've done their job of getting the supplies this far. So Abraham tells the servants to stay there with the donkey, and he and Isaac are going to go the rest of the way alone. But look at what Abraham tells them is going to happen. He says that he and the boy are going to go over there to the mountain. They're going to worship, And then the way that this sentence is constructed, Abraham is saying that he and the boy are both going to come back again to the servants. Like, how could he say that, right? Like, he knows that he's going over there with the boy to offer him as a burnt offering. And the thing about burnt offerings is they're completely consumed on the altar. Like, there's nothing to come back with. So is he lying to his servants so they don't get suspicious and stop him from doing what he's supposed to go do? Like, no. Abraham is convinced that that's what's going to happen. Like, he really believes that he and Isaac are going to go up that mountain and somehow, some way, they're both going to come back down again. Like, the author of Hebrews tells us this is what Abraham believed in this moment. Hebrews 11, 17 to 19 says, "By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, 'Through Isaac shall your offspring be named.' He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back." So in Abraham's mind, he knows Isaac is the son that God had promised, and he's the son that all the other promises hinge on. And so as confusing as it is that God tells Abraham to offer Isaac as a burnt offering, Abraham's thinking, God might really have me go through with this. But then the only option is that he'll raise Isaac back from the dead, because I know he keeps his promises. And so because he believes that, he tells his servants, I and the boy will go over there and worship, and then we'll be back. And he takes the knife and the wood, he lays the wood on Isaac's shoulder, takes the fire and the knife, and both of them go on together. So look at the other statement then of Abraham's unwavering faith in the next section here in verses 7 and 8. So they go on, both of them together, and then Isaac says to his father, Abraham, "My father." And he says, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went, both of them, together. So Abraham and Isaac, they're making their way up the mountain, and Isaac notices that they're missing something. So he asked his father, and you can just hear the trust that he has for his father, and the tenderness and love Abraham has for his son in their interaction here. And this is the second, "Here I am." Like, Abraham is listening, ready to respond to Isaac's question. And so Isaac says, "Hey, we've got everything for this offering except the offering. Where are we going to get that?" And so I don't know if he's starting to connect the dots and if that's what prompts this question here. But again, like, this whole thing is just so unthinkable that it's hard to imagine it even crossing his mind that the plan would be to offer him. The whole point is Abraham's response to Isaac's question. Like, how can he possibly answer that question? What comes out of his mouth is the faith that has been fueling every step he's taken to this point. It says, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Just like with the servants, he's not hiding the truth. He's struggling to put together two things that don't seem to fit. Isaac is the promised son. All the other promises God made hinge on Isaac, but God told him to offer Isaac as a burnt offering. So God's going to have to provide. Like, he doesn't know how. He just knows that's the only solution. And he's seen God provide in unbelievable, impossible situations before. Like, the evidence is walking up the mountain with him right now. So he's completely convinced that God will provide here. And then this section ends just like the last one. So they went, both of them, together. The first time, I think the point is just that they're walking alongside of each other. But now they're going together in another way, like trusting together that God is going to provide. And that's what we see in the final section, where we go back to focusing on Abraham's unhesitating obedience. Now, it's not just Abraham that's obeying. Isaac is too. Look at verses 9 and 10. It says, when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, laid the wood in order, bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. So just like at the beginning of this section, we get this detailed list of the steps Abraham's taking in obeying what God told him to do. He builds an altar. He lays the wood in order on the altar. He binds Isaac, his son, which, again, at this point, Isaac has to be obeying as well. Like, Abraham is over 100 years old at this point, and Isaac is a young man. Like, he could have easily stopped Abraham from binding him if he wanted to, or at least run away. But he submits. After the one question he asked in verse 7, the picture of Isaac in this passage is of a silent, obedient, willing sacrifice. So Abraham bound him, laid him on the altar on top of the wood, reached out his hand, took the knife, raised the knife to follow through with what God told him to do. So again, the whole picture here is Abraham's unhesitating obedience. We never get any indication that Abraham wasn't going to do what God told him to do. From verse 3 until now, he's moving forward to this moment with the knife raised, ready to offer his son. And his unhesitating obedience is fueled by the unwavering faith he expressed in the two center sections. Like he believes that somehow, some way, God is going to provide. He may have to go through with this, but God had promised him this son. And he promised that this son would be the key to the rest of the promises. And so as unthinkable as this act is, Abraham believes that God is going to provide and bring Isaac through this, even raise him from the dead if he has to. And that faith that God will provide fuels Abraham's obedience to this moment with the knife raised. And Abraham was right. At the very last moment, God does provide. Like that's what we see in the final scene of this passage then. God's provision, a substitute sacrifice, and a divine oath. And so we're going to have to fly through this, but there's two sections to this final scene. First, God spares Isaac and provides a substitute sacrifice, and then he reconfirms his promises to Abraham and guarantees them with an oath. So look first at verse 11. It says, "But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.'" So this is almost identical to verse 1, except the angel of the Lord is speaking on behalf of God here, which we don't have time to get into. He calls Abraham's name twice here, which you can imagine, like this is an urgent moment. He needs to get Abraham's attention quickly. And again, Abraham responds, "Here I am." Like he probably has never been happier to listen and obey than in this moment. And look what God tells him to do this time, though. Verse 12. He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Like Abraham passed the test. Would he trust God and obey when asked to do the unthinkable? Yes. Like the test revealed the genuineness of Abraham's faith. That's what this means, that he now knows that Abraham fears God. It's not as if God didn't know before. The point is that this test and Abraham's response showed the genuineness of Abraham's faith for everyone, including us, to see. And that's what fearing God is all about. It's about trusting him completely and obeying him fully, even when he asks us to do what seems impossible, unbelievable, or unthinkable. Like fearing God looks like unhesitating obedience and unwavering faith. And Abraham displayed both in his response to God's command. So God tells Abraham not to lay his hand on the boy or do anything to him. He spares Isaac's life at the last moment. And then he provides a substitute sacrifice in Isaac's place. Verse 13. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And so the way this is worded, it's as if Abraham, hearing the call to stop and lifting up his eyes and seeing the ram caught in the thicket happened simultaneously. So God stops him from offering Isaac and provides a substitute in the same moment. And it says that Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering. Like, do those actions sound familiar? Like, it's the same three words as what Abraham was told to do in verse 2. So Abraham obeys God's initial command just with the ram instead of his son, which leads to verse 14. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Abraham believed that God would provide. That belief fueled his obedience. And then God did provide. He spared Isaac and provided a ram as a substitute sacrifice. And so Abraham named the mountain where all this happened, "The Lord will provide." And apparently all this inspired a saying that's passed down through the generations, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Like, that's the takeaway from all this. The Lord will provide. Like, Abraham believed it, and it fueled his obedience. And because he obeyed, he experienced the Lord's provision in ways he never would have seen otherwise. Now, but the story doesn't end here. God does one more thing in response to Abraham passing the test. He reiterates his promises to Abraham, and he guarantees them with an oath. Look at verse 15. It says, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, as the sand that's on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gates of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. I wish we had more time to press into these verses, but notice a couple of things really quickly here. First, for the most part, these promises aren't new. They're repeating promises that God had made, going all the way back to chapter 12 and picking up on language that came in chapter 13, chapter 15, chapter 17, bringing it all together here. But one thing that's different is the reason God says he's going to do these things. Did you notice this? It's because Abraham obeyed. He says it twice, at the beginning and at the end. At the beginning he says, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. And at the end, because you have obeyed my voice. And we all say, wait a minute. I thought John just said last week that we become heirs of Abraham's promises by faith, not by works. I thought Abraham believed the Lord and it was counted to him as righteousness. Like, are the promises now based on Abraham's works? Like, did he earn the promises by obeying God in this test? So I am so thankful that James answers that very question for us. James chapter 2, verses 20 through 23 says this. He says, do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works, and the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So there's so much going on in there. But what James is saying is that there's a sense in which you could say that Abraham was justified by works, but only in the sense that his faith, or that faith that doesn't work, isn't faith at all. Abraham's works were the overflow of his faith. Like, his faith acted. His faith was completed by his obedience. And so, in other words, Abraham's obedience proved the genuineness of his faith. And so in that sense, Abraham's obedience here doesn't contradict the earlier passage that says Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. James says it fulfills it. Like, it's exactly what we've been talking about all along. Abraham's faith that God would provide fueled his obedience. And with Abraham's obedience as proof of his faith, God reiterates his promises to Abraham. The other thing that's different here is that he goes a step farther than just repeating what he's already promised. The other different thing here is in the first few words. He says, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord. Like, God doesn't just reiterate his promises, he guarantees them with an oath. Like, he swears by himself that he will surely do the things he had promised Abraham he would do. And so the author of Hebrews comes back to this passage and helps us understand what's going on here. Hebrews 6, 13 through 15. He says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. Like, in this moment, because Abraham trusted and obeyed, God doubly guarantees his promises. And not only can Abraham already have confidence that God will keep his word because God said he would, now he swears on himself. Like, this is rock solid, unshakable, as good as done. Like, the author of Hebrews says that right here, after all these years of patiently waiting, Abraham obtained the promise. Like, Abraham believed that God would provide. That faith fueled his obedience, and God provided. He provided a substitute for Isaac, and he provided an oath guaranteeing that everything he had promised Abraham would come to pass. Like that's the connection between Abraham's faith, Abraham's obedience, and God's provision. Faith in God's provision fueled Abraham's obedience. And because Abraham trusted and obeyed, he experienced God's provision. And so the question is then, what does any of that have to do with us? Well, at one level, it has everything to do with us because these promises that Abraham obtained because of his obedience and faith here ultimately include us. Like remember, in the storyline of Genesis, these promises to Abraham are God's plan to undo the curse of the fall and to bless all the families of the earth through him and his offspring. So the fact that we're even gathered here this morning is the direct result of Abraham's faith that God would provide, fueling his obedience. Oh, but on top of that, just like faith in God's provision fueled Abraham's obedience, faith in God's provision fuels our obedience as well. And that's what you can see next on your handout here. Faith in God's provision fuels our obedience. And Genesis 22 points ahead to how that's true. Just like God's provision for Abraham in the past, in the birth of Isaac, produced steadfastness in him and fueled his faith that God would provide for him in the future when he was asked to sacrifice Isaac, God has provided for us in the past in a way that should fuel our faith when our faith is tested as well. And the thing is, God's provision in the past for us is the ultimate provision Abraham was looking forward to. And it's a provision that the story we just looked at foreshadows in so many beautiful ways. Like God's ultimate provision for Abraham and for us is in Jesus. Just think about how this passage points us to him. Like, see God's ultimate provision in Jesus here in this passage. He is the ultimate offspring of Abraham that the promises pointed to. So in verse 17, God starts out by promising to multiply Abraham's offspring like the stars of heaven, the sand of the seashore. So there he's clearly talking about many offspring. But in the middle of verse 17, notice how it changes. He says, and your offspring shall possess the gates of his enemies. Like his, singular. So yes, Abraham will have many offspring, but he will also have one ultimate offspring. And because the final reference to offspring in verse 17 there is singular, that carries over into verse 18 when God says that in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Like yes, at some level that will happen through Abraham's many offspring, but ultimately it will happen through one, through Jesus. But not only is Jesus the ultimate offspring that promises point to, he's the ultimate son that Isaac points to. Like the language that God uses to describe Isaac as Abraham's son, his only son, whom he loves, is the same language that God the Father uses to describe Jesus. Like what did the angel tell Mary before Jesus' birth? That he would be called the Son of the Most High. What does Jesus say in John 3:16? For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And what did the voice from heaven say at Jesus' baptism? It said, this is my beloved son. This is my son whom I love. And what God the Father told Abraham to do with his son is exactly what he would do with his own only son whom he loved. He would place a wooden cross on his shoulders and lead him up a mountain to be offered up as a sacrifice. Only this time, there would be no voice from heaven to stop this father's knife. This time there would be no ram caught in a thicket to take his place. Because not only is Jesus the ultimate only son that Isaac points to, he's the ultimate substitute sacrifice the ram points to. Oh, and it's at this point in the story where Isaac represents us. Like the knife should have come down on us, but God provided a substitute. But it wasn't just a ram, it was his own son, his only son whom he loved. He was offered up in our place so that we could be spared. Oh, and here's where we come back to where this all took place. Like the only other place in the Bible where Moriah is mentioned is 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, which says that Solomon began to build the house of the Lord, the temple, in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. So the very place where Isaac had been bound and the substitute sacrifice had been provided becomes the place where countless sacrifices would be offered in place of sinners, all the way to the day when the ultimate substitute sacrifice would enter Jerusalem riding on a donkey, be arrested, and be crucified just outside this very place. Like, oh, the saying in verse 14 was more prophetic than they knew. Like, on the mount of the Lord, it has been provided. Oh, we've seen God provide for us in the past in Jesus, and that fuels our faith that he will provide for us in the future. Like, this is exactly what Paul says in Romans 8:32. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Like, do you see what Paul is saying here? He's connecting the cross to Genesis 22, and he's saying that if God the Father didn't spare his own son, his only son whom he loves, but gave him up for us all, offering him as a substitutionary sacrifice so we could be spared, like if God has provided for us in that way, nothing else is too much for him to provide for us in the future. So we can trust and obey when our faith is tested. Like, whatever test of faith you're facing, whatever test of faith you may face in the days to come, you can have unwavering faith that God will provide. How? Because you've seen him do it in Jesus. And Jesus' sacrifice in your place guarantees that he will provide for you in the future. And faith in that fuels our obedience, whatever test we face, even when it seems impossible. And that doesn't mean it will happen quickly. Abraham had to wait 25 years for the son that God promised him. And he only ever got little glimpses of the fulfillment of the other promises God made to him and his offspring. It also doesn't mean that he will always provide from an earthly perspective. Like, unless Jesus comes back, we will all eventually come to the point of death. But even then, God will provide. Like, in that moment, God's ultimate provision is resurrection. And so even in that moment, we can face even that test of faith, saying, God, I believe that you will provide. I believe you were able to raise my body from the dead. Oh, like, that is the whole point of this passage. The Lord will provide. He has provided in the past in a way that guarantees he will provide in the future. And faith that he will provide fuels our obedience. It did for Abraham, and it will for us as well. And so when your faith is tested, remember how God has provided for you in Jesus. And let that fuel your faith, that he will provide for you in the future. If nothing else, that he will raise your body from the dead. And that faith will fuel your obedience. And then as you trust and obey, the testing of your faith will produce steadfastness. Let's pray. Father, this passage is weighty and beautiful and profound and beyond anything that we can do justice to in our time together this morning. The picture here of how you provide, not only how you provided for Abraham, but how you provide for us in Jesus is beyond our ability to wrap our minds around, much less put into words. Father, I pray that somehow, some way, in some little way, walking through this passage together this morning would remind us and stir our faith that you will provide, because we've seen you do it in the past. And how will you not also, along with your only Son, whom you love, graciously give us all things? Like, if you would sacrifice him for us so that we could be spared, him becoming our substitute, we can trust that you'll provide everything else that we need. So God, I pray that you would use this passage to stir our faith in him, in you, that you will provide. And Lord, whatever trials we're facing, whatever tests of faith we're walking through, whatever tests of faith may come in the future, Lord, I pray that we would be able, like Abraham, to cling to that you will provide, because we've seen you do it in the past, and we have confidence. You guarantee that you will do it in the future in Christ. And so, Lord, fix our eyes on him, stir our hearts in worship and wonder and awe, at the provision that we've seen you make for us, and cause us then, Father, in faith to cling to you as our provider, that you will provide for us in the future. And I pray that that faith then, Father, would fuel our obedience so that in those moments when it seems impossible, when it seems unbelievable, that we would be able to cling to our faith that you will provide, to cling to you as our provider, and do the next thing, to take the steps of obedience that you call us to take, trusting that you will provide for us in your perfect timing. Lord, help just even thinking about everybody in the room here this morning, knowing what's going on in so many of different people in this room, in our lives. Lord, just pray that you would use that to encourage us this morning and prepare us even for the tests of our faith that we'll face in the days ahead. Lord, thank you for this passage. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you for his sacrifice in our place. Lord, we're just in awe of what you have done for us and how this points us to it. In Jesus' name, amen.